I'm also one of the co-authors of this year's EBU News Report on the future of public service media, which my colleague Alexandra is going to introduce in a moment. And it's my great pleasure, actually, to be moderating this panel on driving innovation in public service media tonight. And we're so lucky to have an absolutely stellar cast of people with us, which I would like to briefly introduce. To my right, we are joined by Helge Solberg. Helge is an award-winning Norwegian journalist and currently the news director at Norwegian public broadcaster NRK. Also with us to my left is Christina Johannesson from Sweden, where she's currently the project manager for future competencies at the public broadcaster SVT and deeply involved in the digital transformation of the same. Then we have the BBC's Ross Atkins, the creator and presenter of BBC's Outside Source and founder of the 50/50 project, which supports the diverse representation of content in various news organizations. And finally, my dear colleague, Alexandra to my left, who after a long career in journalism with stints at the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany and the Reuters Institute in Oxford, now works as an independent media advisor and was the lead author for this year's EBU News Report. Together, we'll try to tackle some of the thornier questions facing public service media these days, namely, what needs to happen that public service media not only survive but thrive? How should they and can they innovate to stay relevant? And what are the obstacles for innovation? How can these be overcome? I'm very much looking forward to discussing these questions with our panel and hopefully with you all. So please give them a very warm welcome, and then we'll start with a short presentation on the report by Alexandra.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to speak for this full room, and actually I apologize to everyone who's still waiting outside in line. I hope you get parts of it. You can access the report later or watch the recording later. Yeah, I'll introduce the EBU News Report to you, and we are thankful to the EBU for sponsoring this and also giving us the editorial freedom to do research in really tricky issues that are not very convenient to deal with also for everyone involved. So let me briefly show you some of our major findings of the report. First of all, what did we do? We divided the report that is actually able to, you can download it without login, and so you can really access it, everyone can. We divided it in 3 parts. The first part will give you the contents, and I'll skip over this fast because we want to talk about innovation so much. The second part is what's next in connecting with audiences and the public. This is what all news organizations, whether big or small, grapple with these days. And third part is what's next in leadership and innovation. This is very interesting, or should be interesting for all of you who are in management, who have to take difficult decisions and to actually lead people. Yeah, and the 3 parts, really contain really 7 Q&As with renowned media leaders and experts on the subject. We had 16 best practice case studies in this, and this is all based on more than 40 interviews with media leaders and experts and the latest research. So this is what the report is. Let's start with the context, and I said I'll skip over this briefly, the world around public service media, we call it, and the great thing is, and that's why we named this panel Trust Boosters. The great thing is actually that COVID, the pandemic, made trust in news rise on average with all news organizations. According to the Digital News Report by the Reuters Institute, 6 percentage points last year. This is actually unheard of in recent years when it was constantly dropping a little bit. And actually, public service media were leading the way in this. If you dig into the report, you can see that with public service media, they consistently, or in most markets, I have to say, when there's true independent public service media, they consistently topped the trust ratings in almost all markets. And to the contrary, trust in social media has declined further because people have lots of bad experiences with social media. sad thing is, and why I'm mentioning this here, there are tons of panels about press freedom and declining press freedom, media freedom here in Perugia. I still have to mention this because you need to know the climate where innovation can really grow or is hampered and cannot grow. So it's really important to mention this. And actually, yeah, media freedom has declined in many countries. Attacks against journalists have increased. You all know that, with women and minorities disproportionately being targeted, and the Ukraine war has now pushed this to an entirely new level. So very difficult context for public service media, and also the risk to funding and governance. And we have a case study on there on the Swiss broadcaster that has successfully fended off a referendum only to be met with further resistance in Swiss society, and what they are doing now to tackling this. Yeah, these are one set of forces. Free market advocates feel that actually there's enough media out there. People have so many choices. You don't need public service media. And then obviously you all know about liberal political actors who want to restrain media freedom and really lobby against funding. And then you have the sheer competition, and that's why we called the report "What's Next in an Age of Information Abundance and Distraction and Opinion," because there's so much competition for attention, and this is the real issue for most media organizations. Sometimes it's a trust issue, but it's not necessarily a trust issue. It's an attention issue, and it's really this, getting the eyeballs, getting people really to look at you, and building up stable, loyal relationships with the audiences. And yeah, I just mentioned to showcase what we've in the report, a case study of, for example, Finnish Wiley Arena that have really been successful competing with Netflix in the Finnish market. They don't only stream movies and stuff, but they also include news in their streaming services, and they actually topped Netflix in the age group above 40, and even with younger people, they're really successful. So you can find case studies in that, and actually there are also the opportunities of public-private partnerships that are difficult to navigate, but could be a way to proceed in this competition for attention against all the distraction. Yeah, and we also interviewed Noel Coran, the EBU Director General, who said the biggest protection of funding is to have a strong, firm connection with your audience, for them to feel you're meeting their needs, and for you to change and adapt to what those needs are. And we'll learn from our panelists later how they do that in their various organizations. Yeah, connecting with audiences and the public, which is the second part of the report, and we really dig deep on issues like news avoidance. How do you really can really connect with the public, build stable relationships? And I have to show you my all-time favorite infographic of the digital news report of the Reuters Institute. This was actually from 2019, and I just want to show you, have your attention on the top two. The top two bars, because actually what people said when they were asked, what is the media doing a good job at, most of them said, oh, keeping me up to date about what's happening. They're really good at that. But look at the top two things, like, media is really good at covering the topics that feel relevant to me and my life. Not that many people, not even a third of people gave them high marks for that. And really, really bad is what they said about, do they really use the right tone to approach me? Only 16% back then said, media using the right tone. So some findings we had derived from all these interviews in the report, really, content strategies should focus on providing solutions and ideas for audiences' problems, needs, and struggles, and not primarily on politics and conflicts. And I have to reveal here that I'm a board member of Constructive Foundation, so I'm really invested in constructive journalism, but this is a way out of that, really, this battle for attention. Also, another big thing, a problem that most media are struggling with, is diversity. And in particular, public service media need to reflect society as they are in their diversity, and they need to meet the audiences where they are. Who, if not public service media, need to do that in a broad sense? And lastly, the latest technology, and this is what Felix is studying, artificial intelligence in newsrooms. How can you really help serving audiences better? And so the latest technology can actually help to serve audiences, but there are also tricky issues about that, and we will learn, Helge will talk to us about, the platforms and the competition. Which platforms should you really have your content on? What should you do about that? Yeah, and this is just a quote from Anlagerkrantz, who's actually the head of news and sports at Swedish TV, so a colleague of Christina. And I think this is so important. She said, journalism needs to be curious about what will happen tomorrow. It's also about how we interview people. Are we confrontational or are we curious? And the tone of voice is really important, and all of you grew up in journalism like I did with the news agency and later on with major German media brands. You know, you learn to be confrontational in interviews, like these tough political interviews, and Russ can tell us a lot about that, but you know, not all people need this confrontational style. They shy away from this, so you need to really up your listening skills very often. Yeah, and we have case studies in there that are intended to reach out to diverse audiences, and one is from Deutsche Welle. We have people from Deutsche Welle sitting in the audience in front row, I happen to know. They developed this nice format, flipping the script, where actually regular people interviewed politicians on a talk show put on its head, so not the typical top-down thing that you have in journalism so often. So that was just an innovative format tested for the German election, but it worked quite well. And another case study, I really, is one of my favorite case studies, is the News Values Project by Swedish Radio, because when they came actually up with an algorithm that reflects public service values, and they are very open to talk to you about how they went about this. But this is very interesting for the people who always think like, oh, these algorithms, you know, we need people making news choices and edit stuff, but actually you can have in the digital world, it's really important that you also feed algorithms with public service values and learn how to do that, to use technology to the benefit and not just to increase income, revenue, and fulfill a business model that is based on eyeballs. Yeah, and also this is obviously the biggest challenge for many news organizations, particularly for public broadcasters that have, very often in the traditional broadcasting departments, age averages of like 60, 70 and above. So reaching young audiences is a big challenge for all traditional media. And actually, this is a quote, and I left it in here, even though Helge is here, but she said, we know quite a lot what the concern of young people is. They're very value-driven. They want to understand the society around them. They're interested in foreign news. Climate journalism is their #1 interest. Tolerance, diversity, anti-racism, all this is very important to them. So it's so important to study what young audiences really want. Then again, it also gets challenging. How do you serve these needs? Yeah, and lastly, the last chapter in the report is about leadership and innovation, and this is actually why I'm so happy to have Christina on this panel here, because I haven't really seen a news organization that adept at changing cultures systematically, and believe me, I know quite many news organizations, as SVT has done very systematic change of culture in the newsroom, and Christina later on will tell you all about this. And I've also included here a Q&A with Martin Reeves, who's not a journalist, but he's an author, he's a consultant, he runs a think tank for the Boston Consulting Group, and he wrote this book, The Imagination Machine, that I personally found very impressive. And I'll just have one quote here by him, which is so central to many of these organizations that we have today, particularly public service with very traditional hierarchical ways. And he said, failures of imagination are failures of leadership. And he sort of elaborated on how you can turn your really slow organizations in imagination machines, because he said his advice, don't wait for the next Steve Jobs. Do it now. So change is the new normal, and obviously not only change, but you have to have this change, and to have society represented, you also need leadership, also needs to invest in talent and diversity. And I guess it's no miracle to you that the industry is running into a pretty big talent crisis that is not necessarily felt at the top brands, but very much so if you talk to any traditional local or regional news organizations, anyone who's not the New York Times or the FT or whatever, it's really very hard to attract talent, and it's really hard to attract the talent that is diverse enough to represent society as it is. And I'm quoting Kai Gnifke here, who's the Director General of German SWR, and he was very self-critical in his interview, very reflective, and he said, we print shiny brochures about diversity and raise the rainbow flag, but when push comes to shove, the old mechanisms prevail, particularly leaders haven't met their own standards. And I think this is really important, because we have so many panels about diversity also in this festival, but not that much happened, and maybe we can highlight that question also later. And innovation, another point, innovation is on everyone's mind, and I am a consultant helping mostly regional publishers with their digital transformation, and the experience is really that there's very often no shortage of ideas, and many projects are started all the time. But as Juliane Leopold here, Editor-in-Chief Digital of German ARD Aktuell, said, there's actually too much reinventing the wheel. Too many organizations are trying to innovate all for themselves. And she said, I'd like to see more collaborations in innovation, really. And that is something that I think the future really belongs to, collaboration, because there's so much power in the market. And Nick Newman, who's a senior research associate at the Reuters Institute, he says it really, maybe public broadcasters are a bit slow at times, a bit hierarchical, but when they can, get their act together, when they really can go to when they really get going, then they can have a huge impact and shift the market. They have the size and scope to bring the nation together, which I think is a very exciting prospect. And so really this is the last appeal here is really, let's do it together. And the EBU has also interesting and exciting projects of collaboration. The last one, it wasn't the last one they launched, but last year they launched a European Perspective, which is actually a start, a content recommendation tool that is where all participating broadcasters have their best content that could be relevant for all markets fit in, and then they use automated translation to make it accessible to different languages. And when we talked about that, I learned that actually even the process of getting everyone together and trying to collaborate really generated so many lessons as such that was even worth it, even without this launch of this successful product. So capitalizing on advantages of international cooperation, collaboration, networking, and learning will help organizations and their leaders to keep up with the pace of change and find solutions to shared challenges. And I strongly believe in that. And with that, I hand back to Felix.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for providing us with sort of the backdrop for the discussion that we are about to have. And I would actually like to step back for a moment and ask our panelists what the state of innovation is within their respective PSMs and how they see it. And let's start with Helly and then go over to Ross and Christina.
Well, NRK has been fairly successful in adapting to the changing media landscape. We reach now 92% of the population.
You have to switch on the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
No, yes, so NRK has been fairly successful to adapt to the changing media landscape. We reach now 92% of the population every day. That's slightly more than we did in 2010. The global giants are still not as big as us, but they're coming closer. Facebook reaches like 75%, while Facebook 56%. We have been, I'm quite impressed by NRK actually, and I've only been with NRK for 4 years, but of course there are always things to work on.
So on average, a positive evaluation. How about the BBC, Ross?
Hi. Well, I guess unlike my esteemed colleagues up here, I'm not a manager, so I'm not actually in charge of anything. I'm a TV anchor, so I have some soft power, but I definitely don't have any hard power. I can't tell anyone to do anything. I don't have a budget. And so I look at innovation from the other side. I'm not in a formal leadership role. So when I'm thinking about an idea that I have, I'm working on the basis that it's probably not going to happen. I'm working on the basis that if I'm going to make this a success, this isn't just something I need to have one meeting about. This is something that I'm going to need to work on for 6 or 12 or 18 or 24 months. And I need to see this not as a single act of innovation, but an ongoing piece of work. So a couple of innovations I've been involved in have been the 50/50 project, which is now in around 100 organizations around the world, which started on a sofa in the BBC newsroom a few years ago when I talked to some colleagues about it, or the explainer videos I do, which you may have seen on social media. That's something I started working on in 2019. And when I started thinking about those explainer videos, I wasn't just thinking, hey, why don't I see if I can make some viral videos? I treated this like a product development. So I was thinking about marketing, distribution, sourcing of budgets, tonal innovation, design innovation. I was thinking about this entirely as a product that I was developing. And then because I'm an individual, I can't just sign off a budget to fund innovation. You also need to think about, well, how can I build not a team, not a formal team, but a group of people around this idea who also feel like they have some ownership of the idea. So one of the most powerful things that I've experienced is that if you can share your idea and persuade people it's worth their creative energy too, then you get a double benefit. You improve the idea, you improve the innovation, but you also give it a much greater chance of success, because within public service broadcasters, and I've only worked in one, quite rightly, this is public money we're spending, right? We can't just sign big checks because we think it's a good idea off the cuff. We need to be serious about the money that we spend, and we need to not do it quickly. And so quite often when I'm developing ideas in the BBC, I don't expect the BBC to give me any money. I don't expect the BBC to give me any staffing for these ideas. So 50/50 had no funding at all for almost 2 years. These explainer videos I was working on for well over a year before the BBC put any resourcing behind it. And that's not a criticism. That's fine. Because I think within public service broadcasters, we need to be supportive and encouraging of innovation, but also respectful of the fact that every idea we have, and I've had plenty of bad ideas, aren't always going to work. And it's impossible to test those ideas very, very thoroughly before you expect your organization to institutionally come behind it. So because I don't have a formal position of leadership, I'm a very keen student of how you build those relationships and those funding models and those distribution models to give you an informal chance of success, because you don't necessarily have the power to do it the formal way initially.
Well, you're hopefully on the right panel for that. But what I find interesting here is the sort of element of cultural, the culture within the organization that's important to innovation. That's something actually I would like to, Christina can probably speak about this a lot, because you've been driving culture change within SVT, right?
Yes, and I have my roots in the newsroom, and I'm a reporter myself, and I used to be the head of news gathering department at SVT. And I mean, we've been working on change for a long, long time. SVT, like many other public service media, come from historically quite a comfortable position. We had a really strong position in society, and safe funds, stuff like that. But a few years ago, I mean 5 or 6 years ago, the situation wasn't so comfortable anymore. We were losing contact with generations of news consumers. And during, it was a period, maybe you remember, with terrorist attacks in Europe, and we were so far behind the competition, and it was so embarrassing for us. And we realized that we really had to do something about that. At this point, I'm not saying that we are anywhere near in a good position again, but we have managed to turn this tanker around to slowly go into the right direction. And we have slowly managed to move in a serious way from broadcast to digital news delivery. And we are reconnecting with generations again. And this year we were happy to see, or during that suddenly our digital news app was one of the most preferred by the young audience. And to us, young is people that are between 20 and 39. So, but this has been the result of enormous effort, and especially enormous effort on culture and leadership.
Can you briefly elaborate a bit more about how you actually did this turning of the tanker? Because it sounds as simple as turning the steering wheel, but of course in reality it's a lot more complicated. So what were your concrete actions to do that?
Well, it's very important to remember that there are no single magic solution. There is always a number of different things that has to be combined. But in cultural terms, in order to adapt and change and innovate, all leaders want staff that are engaged, that come with good ideas, that have the energy to do change. But we realized that we actually fostered a culture of passive co-workers. We call this the baby bird syndrome, because we did a lot of changes to support, a lot of efforts, quite radical ones, to support change. We reorganized, moved a lot of resources to digital, and we everyone in the newsroom, national newsroom, for instance, had to reapply for their jobs. Not that they would be, fired, but they had to. We needed to relocate staff, and also managers. We replaced in one blow 70% of all the managers in national newsroom. But still, the culture was still there. 1 year after, we had just reinforced the old culture. And what kind of culture were that? We found ourselves in a situation where managers, editors, leaders on all levels were feeding down solutions and answers and details to a large extent. And that was really exhausting. And the co-workers, they were acting like baby birds, and they just asked more and more, what are we supposed to do now when we are in this change position? And this made us very slow, and it made change didn't happen quickly enough. So, do you want to know what we did about it?
I'll probably come back to that later. Thank you so much. Something else I would like to sort of tease out here in this panel is the role of innovation when it comes to connecting with audiences and in order to stay relevant. And we often hear this sort of talk about reaching young audiences, and as we all know, that's easier said than done. Khalid, do you want to talk to us a bit about what you've been doing at NRK to sort of connect with young audiences, especially on platforms, without falling into this trap of becoming too dependent on these very platforms in your work?
NRK News is on Snapchat Discover, and we have been there for 3 years now, and we are doing that, first of all, because we learn how to connect with a younger audience, and it's also a pure mobile-first experience. So what is essential for us is to use that knowledge and what we learn on Snapchat and apply that on NRK's platforms. Having said that, the platforms are here to stay, but we have to be very conscious why we are on those platforms and what we want to achieve. And for us, it's very much more important for us to succeed on NRK's platforms than any third platforms. And that's why we are now building down our presence, especially on Facebook. And the major media companies in Norway, NRK, Schibsted, and A-Media, have said that we are not going to be on Facebook News. What is Facebook News? The aim is to be a trusted source for news and present the most important stories, most important and interesting stories of the day. And that's our position. So we must not give that position to Facebook. We must not create user habits that make people believe that you can go to Facebook to get the news.
So it's basically weaning yourself off platform dependencies itself a strategy of innovation, because most media organizations these days have become quite reliant on these companies. And at NRK, you've basically said, we will try to, as a sort of innovation strategy, we will try to move away from that in reaching younger audiences.
Yeah, no, of course, that's easy to say being in the Nordics, because we are not dependent on third platforms. And I'm not saying that this is the solution for everyone, but in the Nordics, distribution is important, but destination is much more important. And to develop our platforms, our digital platforms, that is NRK TV, NRK Radio, and NRK on mobile. And if we are to keep our position in the years to come, we need to grow on those platforms, and we need to reach younger and broader digitally.
Yeah, which is basically also something Ross has done quite successfully with the outside source. How important is for use of the role of audiences in innovation?
Well, I think audiences, if you're a public service broadcaster, are essentially everything. They're the reason you exist. And so all of your innovations should be with a very clear mission to better serve the audience. And if you're not entirely focused on that, then you're unlikely to innovate in a way that's helpful for public service broadcasters. I would also add, and this might seem like an obvious point, but I think it's worth saying, if an organization says it believes in innovation, but it doesn't reward the people who innovate, people notice. So one of the reasons I started 50/50 was I was tired of listening to, and this is not directed at the BBC, this is across news media, leaders in news media saying they cared about diversity, and I could see what was in the news. It wasn't diverse enough. So I thought, okay, there's a gap here between what we're saying and what we're doing. And people notice, audiences notice, and staff notice. So similarly, within public service broadcasters, if the leadership is saying, we believe in innovation in a range of different ways, we believe in culture change, but the people who are being promoted, or the people who are being paid the most, or the people who are getting the most attention from the organization aren't doing the things which the organization says that it would like you to do, people notice. But there is a reverse of that, which is they also notice when the organization supports the things which it says. So if you take my explainer videos, we kind of ended up with a much bigger hit than we expected to, which was a nice surprise. And what was interesting was we'd done several things, high-profile things, which as an organization demonstrated we were supportive of it. So I still do, have a TV show called Outside Source, which was based around a big touchscreen. To support these explainers, we completely ripped up the format and completely changed it so all of the graphics were mobile-friendly. And that was a very powerful way of saying, internally, the BBC is committing to not throwing away, but fundamentally changing the successful TV news format in order to serve digital audiences better. Equally, they know, because they can see it happening, I now have 2 full-time producers working on the explainer videos who I didn't used to have 12 months ago. And they're being funded by the digital section of the BBC News budget, not the TV news section, despite the fact that I'm a TV news anchor. That says very effectively, this organization gets that TV and digital crossover, and this organization gets that this is an innovation which we want to support. And it might seem obvious, but all of us as as people within public service broadcasters, if we're serious about supporting innovation, you need to act in that way. And if you do, I don't know, you're going to hear about how you guys got on, but my observation of the BBC is that recently it's become much, much better at acting the way that it's been talking for some time. And that is arguably, for me, the biggest driver of innovation within our newsroom.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think Alexandra wants to step in here.
Yeah, I'm sure most of you know what the 50/50 project is or what the explainer videos are. For those of you who don't know, the 50/50 project was really Ross started this as an internal competition. Can you actually get male and female sources to a ratio of 50/50? And this is actually a great example that innovation doesn't always need this huge budget, and it doesn't always need, tons of decision, a 5-year plan and something huge to implement. Because very often this is just an excuse. Oh, we don't have the budget, and we are public service media, or we are just a local news organization for that matter. But actually innovation can start with individuals who have ideas and then know that they have to work the organization. And this is exactly what Russ is talking about. And the explainer videos are another thing that you might not familiar with them. I promise if you go on social media and you look at Russ explainer videos about, the Downing Street parties and whatever, you really get hooked. You want to watch more of those. So I can't explain what they're all about, but if you haven't seen them, check them out.
Thank you.
Thank you. One thing I would actually like to talk about a bit more is sort of the nitty-gritty of how can innovation happen, how can it be done, what are the sort of the tips and tricks, basically also as like a giveaway to the audience, both in the room and digitally. So let's start with Christina and then work our way back to Ross and Helge. How can one marshal support for a project in what is, I think, and I try to say this diplomatically, but PSM are a very cautious environment, and we've heard this today. So how does it work? How do you marshal support internally for innovative projects, for new ideas? How do you do that?
Well, I work on the overall culture, to create a development culture where learning and trying and experimenting is something that is part of your everyday life. And in order to do that, you need to have the foundations. You need to have, for instance, a clear view on where you're heading. You need to have a strategy, and that needs to be built on the audience. What does the audience need? And on top of that, you need to have clear roles. So you need to have a clarity in who decides if a project should be launched or not. Because very often an obstacle to innovation and change is that people that should make decisions don't know about it and are not saying either yes or no. So clarity in roles, clarity in what is expected from you, and then you need to have feedback. You need you need to have a leadership that empowers, that grants the freedom to people that have ideas, but not abandon them. You need to have feedback so that you know that you are in line with what the audience needs. You need to check that it's not for our own sake, it's for the audience. Are we doing this in a direction that is benefiting the audience? That has to be clarified. And if you are not working around that, then you create more confusion, because there's nothing that is so demoralizing as you have a strategy and then people are not following it, and nothing happens.
Could I just look at this quickly from the other side, which is, of course, if an organization, a public service broadcaster or any news organization has very clear decision-making processes, that makes innovation more realistic. I'm going to look at it from the other side as someone who's not in leadership, and of course I'm hoping for those clear lines, and the BBC is pretty good on this, but every single time I've got an idea I'm trying to get out, I make a map of the organization and the different people who I need to say yes, and the different people who could say no, and how I'm going to suggest the idea to one person is not going to be the same way as I suggest it to another. I don't mean I'm being dishonest, but the person who's involved in developing the technology or the design is not going to have the same considerations as the person who controls the budget or my editor. And there'll be some people, like my editor at the moment is absolutely brilliantly and very supportive of innovation. if she doesn't say yes, I can't do it, basically. So like she's the number one priority. But there are a number of other people who can support us or not actively try and stop us. And so you're right to aspire to incredibly clear lines of leadership and decision making. But as someone on the other side, inevitably that's never going to be perfect. So I would always say, if you've got an idea, make a map. Think about, and if you don't know someone, a crucial person on that map, who do you know who does know them? Find out about them. What kind of meetings do they like? What kind of conversations do they like? And take that side of the equation seriously. Because I sometimes see people, they'll go to the top, and I'm like, the people, someone that high up is not going to be the person to sign it off. You need to be 2 down on that decision, but on another decision, so really being quite detailed in your, I'm constantly ringing people up going like, okay, so you've switched it around in this department, so who's in charge of what now? I'm constantly analyzing so I understand the game I'm in, if you like.
Yeah, it's really great you say that, Ross, because what I tell clients in consulting is usually from my own really bitter experience, map your friends and enemies. And then, map your friends and enemies, but then don't waste all the energies of winning over the enemies first, but start with the friends. And we really always say to our clients in the project I'm involved in, the Table Stakes Euro project, really start with readiness for change. Start with those who are your friends, and then start with short success, or with quick success stories. And once you have these success stories, you can go from there.
Can we get again?
Yeah, no. Well, it all starts with the needs of the audience, but a premise for innovation is that we test, evaluate, and adapt in the process. So we need to change while going forward. That's why it's so important to establish a learning culture. And sometimes the idea is so strong that it just needs some minor adjustments, but other times, and I must say that's mainly my experience, things end up very differently than what we expected. And so it's very important to have open process. And for instance, NRK Play. It's, of course, drama and entertainment, that's a very important part of NRK Play, but news is and will be important. But we don't know what the role of the news will be in NRK Play. And so we have to facilitate processes that motivate creativity and have as many doors open as long as possible, and we need to navigate that ambiguity and be open and transparent about not knowing. And this is very different than if you are to build a hospital. Then you know exactly what you want to do, and change is not wanted or needed unless it's about saving money. While what we are trying to achieve is change is desired and needed, and we don't know the outcome.
So basically we have a situation where on the one hand, sort of top down, we need clear structures, clear processes, and in the absence of that, or in the time while this develops, we need sort of the cheekiness and the planning that Ross suggested, where you basically try to find out.
I also think there's an underused skill that if we can blow our own trumpets, we're storytellers, right? That's what journalists are. If we're good at anything, we're hopefully good at telling stories. We're not always so good at telling stories about innovation within our organizations. So before I went to speak to anyone about the 3 or 4 ideas I've managed to get off the ground in the last 10 or 15 years, I spent ages thinking about how am I going to tell the story of this innovation? How am I going to make this so that it's easy to say yes to? Because a lot of the time when you're trying to innovate, public service broadcasting is a big operation. The people who need to support these ideas up here, they're very, very busy. They haven't got much time. If you make it easier for them to say yes by having a good story and by having done as much of the work as you can before you go and see them, that's going to be easier. If you walk in with a half-developed idea and say, I need thousands of pounds and loads of staff, your chances are quite low. They should be quite low, I should add. It's not a criticism.
Christina, your response?
Yes, because I think this is a crucial thing that, I mean, as a manager or an editor or leader of journalists, you should not be too busy to lead journalists. I mean, it's about prioritizing your time. And in order to get this innovation or development, you need to pay attention to your reporters or your coworkers or anyone. And we had the privilege to be able to hire really talented co-workers from other digital newsrooms, and they came to us loaded with all this capacity. And after a year, some of them left. And I asked, what's wrong? And many of them said, you know what? It feels like SVT is totally indifferent to what I do. I said, no, that can't be true, because you're so praised. Your boss is praising you, and this morning on the morning meeting, you got this credit for what you did yesterday. And they said, well, you know, a pat on the back doesn't really help me, because I know that I might be the sharpest on the market right now, but I won't be in 2 years if I stay at SVT and the leadership culture doesn't change. Because, I mean, we have a tradition where people are promoted. You're a good reporter, and then you get promoted to an editor, and then you get promoted to a manager, and then you stand there and you're good at doing television pieces 15 years ago. And in that culture, I'm not saying that it's this all the time, definitely not, but often you don't know how to lead people. No one tells you what is expected of a leader in public service. What kind of skills do you need to obtain in order to develop this young, really brilliant talent that you had the possibility to hire? That's something totally different than telling, this is how you do a story. So you need to be able to attract their capacity for ideas. You need to learn how to coach a talented person. It's like in an athlete, the trainer doesn't run the sprint, but they can watch, challenge, help you to improve and learn and also innovate. And that's the new role of the leader that we had. We have put 250 leaders in enormous training on this, role play, how to coach and get the best out of a coworker. And it's nothing that you do overnight. It takes years and years and years and lots of effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a general story for innovation. It's not something that can be done like flipping a switch and it suddenly happens.
No.
Can I add something really quick to that, which is that innovation's tiring.
Yes.
And very, very time consuming. And yet often organizations expect their staff to do that as well as whatever their regular responsibilities are. And one thing I've observed the BBC getting much better at, certainly it wasn't very good at this when I arrived, but it's much better now, is spotting when an innovation is happening which requires support and allowing that person, giving that person some, not necessarily resources, just some space in their working week, rather than expecting all the innovation to happen when they get home after their normal job or in the morning before they start their normal job, because for a lot of people that's not necessarily realistic, or they can't do that. And so understanding that creating something new is quite a demanding process, and treating it with respect rather than seeing it as an extra to happen as well as everything else is helpful.
True.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second here. We've basically been operating on the premise that innovation is just a good thing, and we've sort of been treating this as if every single idea that comes along is a good idea. I would like to know from all of you, and let's start again with Helge, then go to Christina, and then end with Ross, because I think he has strong opinions on this. What should we do to filter the good ideas out and sort of separate and get rid of the bad ideas? How do we do that in innovation in PSM?
Well, what we do in NRK is that we have festival of ideas twice a year, and everyone can attend, and you get 3 minutes to pitch your idea, and you get an instant feedback at the festival of ideas, and a more in-depth feedback after 1 or 2 weeks. And that's how we choose which ideas to prioritize.
Christina.
Yeah, I think it's really important to say no sometimes. It is you can't just have like all the ideas like popcorn just popping. You have to have some kind of strategy. What do you want to achieve? And that has to be really well connected to the audience. And then you have to measure success. You need to be able to evaluate, is this a good idea or not? Should we continue with this, or should we just ditch it? And I think that's important. It's the audience. We're here for the audience, nothing else.
Yep. Thank you. Let's go to Ross. What's your take on this?
So I think we need to, I think we could improve how we, not just the BBC generally, explain the process of innovation. I think largely we think of it as, hey, I've got an idea, I'm going to tell the bosses, and the bosses say yes or no, and it's kind of good or bad. And for me, like deep innovation is something that evolves. So if you watch my explainer videos now, they're not the same. They're based on the same idea I had in 2019, but they don't manifest in the same way because some bits weren't so good and some bits were good, and so some bits we changed and so on. So helping everyone understand that there is a process and supporting that process feels very important. Explaining why you're saying no. Sometimes people can be left confused. An idea hasn't worked, but the organization hasn't said no. So establishing success criteria early is, and you know, I've had lots of ideas which have gone nowhere, and I'm very keen on stopping ideas. Like I could do it, try something, doesn't work, okay. And actually, the explainer videos happened because when I created Outside Source in 2014, I had a double idea, which was a kind of live collation of information on the TV, so like a new TV format, which would create digital content. We did the first bit, the ratings were very good on the TV. The digital content we were creating, the numbers were terrible, like not just kind of quite good, terrible. So I sat there in 2019 going, well, one thing worked and the other thing really didn't. And it was from saying that it didn't that we came up with something new. So creating systems which communicate in a supportive way why one idea needs to stop or one idea is going to grow is important. The other thing I would say is all of the best innovation I've been involved in, whether it's an idea of mine or an idea of someone else, often it's informal. So 50-50 happened because lots of people gave me their time because they were excited by the idea. The explainers got developed by brilliant designers, TV directors, producers. The list goes on and on and on. And in the early days, it was just me going, can I have a chat to you? There was nothing formal about it at all. And so I think creating a culture or supporting a culture which has space for those more informal projects where you're just doing it because you're all excited about it is really helpful, because I quite often encounter people who have a very formal idea of how innovation works. They'll come to me and they go, I've got an idea, I'm going to pitch it to the bosses. And they see it in quite a binary way, like the bosses are going to say yes or the bosses are going to say no. And I'm like, even if they say no, it might still be a good idea. We can maybe still do this. Or maybe they'll say yes, and actually after 3 months it won't. And so explaining that innovation is an ongoing piece of work rather than a job interview where either you get it or you don't get it, I think is helpful.
Alexandra, any words from you?
Yeah, I mean, what I was just gonna go to about what Christina said about using metrics, and luckily in our industry, metrics are now being used for many things, but that is actually quite a new thing. Well, maybe except for TV quotas and stuff, you always TV ratings, you always had that, but introducing metrics into the newsroom, people management. This is so important because it used to be the major metric in newsrooms were either gut feeling or opinion. You know, how did you measure success? Well, you know, the editor-in-chief liked it, so it must have been successful. And that is no longer the case, luckily. And another thing I really want to highlight in that context is it's not only about ideas and saying no to fresh ideas. My experience as a consultant is really the hardest thing, because it's not sexy at all, the hardest thing is really stop doing of old practices. And it's funny because I asked in all the interviews I led for this report, I asked, what do you think should public service media stop doing, or what could you stop to do in your organization? And this is usually when things start to get really quiet, because stop doing is something no one likes. Everyone likes to have ideas and fresh ideas and to compete and pitch and whatever, but really saying, this, actually we're doing something, we've done that for 20 years, but actually it's not successful and maybe it's never been successful. How do you stop this? Because people derive their personal value from this, you know? They think, oh, I'm doing this show, or I'm writing this column and this is why I'm important. And then someone says, well, but no one actually watches this, or no one reads this, and you know, and this is such a hard part, really channeling that energy that people have somewhere else, because you need to free up energies to start new things and to implement new ideas. But how do you do that? That is such a tricky question. Maybe I'll pitch a panel for next year's Perugia Festival about that.
Sorry, Karen.
No, it's idea generation in action. Sorry, final point from you.
One thing, and we were talking about this yesterday actually, one thing I'm increasingly obsessed with is that sometimes organizations will do things because they feel like they ought to do them, and then by doing them, that makes them feel better, and so they carry on doing them, even if there's no proof that actually it is a good thing to be doing. So I could give you some examples from UK media outside of the BBC where organizations have decided they need a digital strategy, so they're pushing out digital content. The numbers are just terrible. But obviously, internally, they can point to this and go, look, we're doing this digital innovation and we're pushing out these videos, and no one's going, but hold on, this looks great, but it's not actually, but no one's consuming it. And having a culture in which you could admit, actually, we thought this was a good idea, but it actually wasn't, without that, to your point, bringing any negative, like it being okay to have tried it and okay to stop, is powerful. And I think that, you know, you need good leadership for that.
Yes, and you need to, I mean, pay attention to what you do and watch. If you have items or formats and you see that there are very few watching it, you need to really see why are they? And what can we do to change that? What can we do instead? So, and there's always a way to stretch yourself, always a way to do things better than yesterday, but you need to measure it, of course.
And the other point, of course, is that we don't know which ones are going to work. So, like, you know, there'll be sometimes you think, I've got a great idea, and then people don't want it.
No.
Can I, before we go to questions from the audience, and I know it says no Q&A, but I will simply ignore this and innovate this panel. Can I briefly ask all our panelists what they think needs to happen that public service media not only survive but thrive? Maybe that's not actually innovation, maybe it's something else. So a brief statement from each of you before we go to the audience in the room. Helia.
Well, first of all, we need to stick to our mission and deliver quality every day. We need to innovate and adapt to the changing media landscape, and I would also make the case for collaboration and partnership outside media. But in Norway we have a number of initiatives, NRK collaborating with local, regional and national media, and our latest initiative was started 2 days ago. And 8 media companies in Norway have gone together to verify videos and images from Ukraine that we find on social media, and it will be this operation will be run by Faktisk, our fact-checking site, which is a collaboration between the 6 largest media houses in Norway. And the videos will be available for all medias in Norway.
Christina.
Well, I think it's important, the most important thing is to keep being humble and curious about the audience and to talk to the audience. I mean, rather listen to the audience. That's the key to anything. And then you need to be able to quickly adapt and change and be flexible in order to meet those needs. So I think these are the 2 main things.
Thank you. Ross.
Well, I'm going to slightly repeat what you've already said, which is that in some ways our core mission as public service broadcasters to inform and entertain remains the same as it did when we were created. In some way our mission as journalists hasn't changed at all, to accurately explain and report on what's happening in our world. These things haven't really changed. What's changing is the information ecosystem and the societies in which we're operating in. And sometimes I feel, both with journalism and with public service media, that we're just wishing it wasn't changing, that if only everything could stop, then it would be okay. And I think the information is all around us. The audience is giving us huge amounts of anecdotal information. The audience is giving us huge amounts of data, telling us what they want and how they're consuming. And to your point, we just need to listen very, very closely, and not to be concerned that by manifesting our mission in a different way, it undermines the core mission. For me, the core mission has not altered for the BBC one bit since we were created. It's exactly the same as it's been for decades. How it manifests itself, though, needs to be very, very different. And it seems to me the only way you can get to a manifestation that's going to work for the country that's funding you is by listening very, very closely and observing very, very closely what the people within that country are doing. I know it might seem obvious, but everything is in plain sight.
Yeah. And speaking of listening, it's just been signaled to me that we've got about 5 minutes left. So I would like the audience to ask some question if they want. Please raise your hand and say it. I will repeat it for the people online. Please keep it brief. And yeah, go ahead. Who wants to be first? Yes. I'm just going to repeat this briefly. So the question is, are innovative projects more successful if they try to hone in on a specific segment of the audience, or if they sort of target broader audiences? And if so, what can be done to sort of create successful projects for very vast audiences? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can take that one. I don't think that, I mean, as a public service media, you need to try to reach everyone at some point, but not everyone all the time, because that will not really be, you can't do that. So you need to sort and pinpoint the different target groups and try to reach them. You can't reach, I mean, everyone at the same, all the time, at the same time. You need to target.
Wonderful, thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
My question is for Christina. You're project manager of future competencies. I'm very curious how you define those. What these are future competencies?
Okay, so the question is, what are future competencies?
I have to disappoint you. I will not have the quick answer to that. I will repeat what I said before. It's the ability to adapt. It's the most important competence.
Excellent. I think we've got time for one more question, then we have to wrap up. So if anyone wants to step forward.
Could I just briefly respond to the question before about whether you need to make broad products or targeted products? I mean, without meaning to sit on the fence, I think public service broadcasters probably need to try and do both, but we're much more comfortable, or the BBC is much more comfortable, doing broader products. That's what we've done very successfully for years, and I think we will continue to do them. But how we understand how to more micro-target news products at particular sections of our audience, I think is something that we are working hard on, but it's definitely something that we can develop further. But I don't think that broad products are over, and I'm entirely biased on this. My explainer product is quite deliberately designed to work if you know very little about the subject, but also if you're quite well informed on the subject. It's used very heavily in schools these days. It's also being used by people who are older than teenagers as well. And so I do think there are newer ways we can manifest that mission to be broad, but I definitely think we need more micro-targeted products to go alongside that. And of course, we haven't got all the money in the world, so you have to make decisions about how you do that. But I feel like the diversification in in micro journalism products that we're seeing across the digital arena is something that public service broadcasting is still, not unreasonably, still grappling with. But I feel like in 10 years' time, you will see a greater product diversity, not just from the BBC, but from all public service broadcasters.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think we have to close here. I'm very sorry. Thank you so much for coming, for attending, for my great panelists. I think this was a very exciting discussion. Have a good evening.